questions about the scope of the court, what the court does, and how it's different than other judicial courts in the state. And we'll have Mike McCabe, who's going to be talking about how financing for judicial elections has changed over the years to what we have now. And so it'll be a very, very interesting program, so you're all invited. And with that, I'd like to introduce a special lady to all of us. You're assembling her up, Sandy Pope. And Sandy's going to be around after the program, so if anybody would like to ask questions about the state of our state, please do so. Without further ado, Sandy.
You may have committed me to more than I'm able to do. Sam?
It is on.
It is on.
I'm going to turn that up.
You have to get a little closer.
I have such a gentle voice. Anyway, is that better? Okay, great. Well, thanks for being here. It just always gives me such hope to come out to communities and see this kind of a turnout. And right now we're doing our listening sessions around the district and we're getting tremendous turnout. And as you can imagine, it seems like everybody that attends is kind of on our side of this budget issue. I don't want to take a whole lot of time except thanks to those of you who happened to catch Devil's Advocates today. That was fun. And it has been my pleasure to be asked to introduce our speaker tonight. He's been a friend of mine for many years, not a great euchre player. He's a small business owner. He's a member of a labor group. He's a progressive long before most of us knew what progressives were all about. He's on the budget and the Committee on Education and Workforce. And Mark, you're going to have to explain this to us. Recently appointed senior whip. I'm not sure what senior whip does, but he's also the first vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and a guy that we just couldn't be more proud of, a guy we call neighbor and friend, and I want you to welcome Congressman Mark Pocan.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much. And living in the town of Vermont now, we are the neighborhood. Thank you very much. I just want to give a little bit extra credit to Sonia. You know, I had the great pleasure of serving with. Can I do this, or can you not hear me? Or do you need this for other reasons? Okay. I'm going to do this then, if that's all right. You know, I had the great pleasure of serving with Sonia in the legislature, and she was my treasurer for my campaign for Congress, which I really appreciate. And I just want to share the euchre story a little bit, because I got to warn you about Sonia, because she was a very good euchre player. And what we used to do is when we had late night sessions and there was a gap where we had some dead time, she and I kind of tag teamed, and we would tell people, "Do you play euchre?" We go, "Sonia really wants to learn how to play euchre. Can you play euchre with us?" And we would hustle them in and beat them every time. So there's a reason why the euchre reference comes in. And again, Sonia does a great job for us. Let's give her a nice applause. I'm really glad to be here because that means I'm home for the week. This is only the second week this year we've had a chance to be home from Washington. I get home pretty much every weekend, but to be here for a whole week is especially nice, especially when everything is melting and it's going to be 60-something degrees tomorrow, and it's a really great time to be here. Let me just give you a quick update on Congress. I'll just touch a couple subjects, and I really just want to take your questions and answer whatever is most important to you. You know, we're in the 114th Congress now. We were trying to wait to see how things were going to work with having the Republicans in charge of the House and the Senate. They can't blame Harry Reid for everything anymore in the House, like John Boehner and the Republicans did. And you know, you think they'd have smooth sailing, but unfortunately, it looks like right now they're going to continue to have problems. In fact, they may even have bigger problems because what's going on is that Tea Party wing of the party was 30 or 40 people, the tail that wags the dog that Boehner lets threaten him every time and he acquiesces, is now really 40 or 50. And still, about 10% of Congress at 40 or 50 it's enough that John Boehner, if he decides to not be a leader, he's not being a leader right now, he lets that tail wag the dog, and every time they threaten himself, hit his speakership, he completely acquiesces. So you saw we passed a 1-week funding bill for Homeland Security. It's absolutely ridiculous. They got us to, we were within minutes, at least within an hour of shutdown of government, because again, they think that's just fine. They don't believe in government, but somehow they decided it was a really good idea to run government, even though they don't believe in it. And that's the problem we have, is that really hardcore, extreme wing of the Republican Party, and John Boehner letting them call all the shots. So we've had the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act up. I serve on the Education and Workforce Committee, so we had a 10-hour markup one day. We debated on the floor, we had amendments on the floor, and they pulled a vote because Heritage Foundation opposed it, and that means they can't get it through even in their own caucus. So we're waiting to see if that comes back. So it's a repeating pattern. So you probably wonder why I would ever want to do this job, but let me explain. There are a lot of good things. So as bad as the legislative process is, as broken as the legislative process is, the good things that are still there are still there. And some of those things are working with the agencies. We have actually been able to get a lot done working with the administration and agencies to move things forward. In fact, I've been very pleasantly surprised at how big as a federal bureaucracy as it is, how much we can still get done. That they actually are very responsive. And let me just give you 2 examples last year of some real successes that we had and why they're important. As Sonia mentioned, I'm the first vice chair of the Progressive Caucus now. I really love my work with the Progressive Caucus. There's a wonderful group of people. Keith Ellison from Minneapolis has been very, very good to me. In fact, he's coming to Madison in April. We're going to do a little tag team. One day he's coming to Madison, the next day I'm going to go to Minneapolis, but we're here to talk about our voting rights amendment that I'll talk about in a little bit, but we're really trying to go around the country talking about this more, but he's coming here and I appreciate that. But he and Jan Schakowsky from Chicago and Rosa DeLore from Connecticut and other people have been very, very good mentoring me, someone who's new in Congress, and I really appreciate that. But we've had successes. So the Progressive Caucus last year asked the President to do an executive order to raise the minimum wage to $10.10 for federal contractors, and he did it. And what's significant about it is when you take federal contractors and their subcontractors, that's 22% of the workforce that happens in a single executive order. We had joined with the Equality Caucus and others to ask the President to sign the executive order for non-discrimination in employment for federal contractors, and he did that. We had a success there. And yet this President still has done fewer executive orders than any president in the last 100 years. So for all their complaining about immigration reform and all the other things that we've asked for, and that was another one that we were part of asking for, we've had some real successes there. So that works out really, really well. We still have the bully pulpit of having a chance to be in Congress, to be on the floor of Congress. And I can tell you, if you ask my office, especially in D.C., every time I take the floor of Congress, we get a lot of calls from a lot of interesting perspectives, generally outside the district, often more interesting ones from Texas, go figure, places like that. But we still have that opportunity to talk about things. So whether it be talking about the post office, where the fact that we've got this incredibly burdensome requirement on the post office that's closing and shutting hours down across the district, in these rural parts of the district, that when I go around to Plain, Wisconsin, or Lone Rock, or different parts of the district, when I ask the small business owners and I ask people what they need the most, and because of a lot of bad trade deals from the past, and a lot of jobs have gone overseas, in order to still have a business in those smaller communities, they need broadband and they need the post office. And right now, we're losing hours and we're losing the processing center here in Madison, so mail is going to take a little longer, and they're doing all these things that are hurting those businesses, so we have to have the broadband access. Scott Walker gave back $27 million of money to expand broadband. But those are the things that we really need to have, and that's the kind of stuff that we're really trying to get done. But I can talk about that and try to raise those issues. And on the post office, just an interesting fact, do you know that the requirement for the post office is that they have to pre-fund 75 years into the future their health care? No other agency, no other business, no one does that. But they're required to, so they would have been profitable through, 2011 or so, Keith? And
they're starting to be profitable in terms of their operating.
Yeah, on the operating side, it wasn't for that one provision. It's artificial provision. It costs them so much money out of the budget. But if you get rid of it, people like Daryl Issa who want to close it down and privatize it, and then you'll get rid of it. But we all rely on that, especially those of us out here. I mean, broadband, for those of us who are not in Mount Horeb proper, I see my neighbors here, but I mean, I'm paying $300 a month for 80 gigs through Home Fusion, Verizon. It's the only product we can get. That's about 40 hours on Netflix. I mean, can you imagine trying to have a small business in some of these areas that doesn't have that broadband? I mean, you need to be able to do that. So those are the issues we talk about. The Voting Rights Amendment, the minimum wage increase, trying to help create jobs. One of the things that I've tried to focus a lot on is not only the need to help improve the economy and create jobs, but really the stagnant wages. This is what we've seen. Under President Obama, we've had now 58 or 59 consecutive months of job growth. We have seen the stock market go from the crash to nearly double and stronger than ever where it's at right now. Productivity has gone way, way up. Wages, dead flat. Everything else is moving up, but all the money's going to the top 1 or 2%. And just to give you an interesting figure, in 1988, the average CEO pay to the lowest paid employee was 40 to 1. Right now, that's at 354 to 1. Now, if you put more money into the pockets of us, everyone who's in the middle class and aspiring to be in the middle class, it goes back into the economy. You're going to go out to dinner, you're going to go to a movie, you're going to do something, you're going to buy a sofa. That CEO simply can't buy 354 sofas to make up for the one sofa that we can buy when you're able to with more money in your pocket. And what that does for the economy and creates more jobs. So those are the things I can still do. So I'm still excited about all of that. So all the legislative process, that cartoon you may remember on Saturday mornings, how a bill becomes a law, don't work so much anymore. But everything else is still pretty solid, and we're trying to get things done. And I'll tell you, I'm just going to wrap my comments up with that. And I'd much rather take your questions. And if I understand it right, I'm supposed to work off questions this way?
Well, either way, Mark.
Okay. Do you want me to go through these and then I'll stay open, if that's all right? Because I'm more than glad to do that. Thank you. And hopefully I can read the writing too on all these, so if I don't, help me out on it. Is there a chance someone will attack the Republican senators who interfered with our president's efforts at a peaceful resolution in Iran? This treasonous interference may be a historical first. Yes, you're right. I think there's a lot of conversations about it this week right now. I think they're starting to realize that what they did was an overreach, but it's more than an overreach, right? I mean, and let me take it a step back to the visit we had by Prime Minister Netanyahu. All right, I think that's where all of this comes from. So John Boehner already broke protocol by inviting the Prime Minister 2 weeks before the Israeli election to come before Congress to criticize the President on foreign policy on the same spot that the President delivered the State of the Union address. Now, it's fine to have a leader of another country come and talk to us before Congress. That happened. We've had, I think, 2 others since I've been in Congress. But the timing and why was terrible. And to exclude the White House from this, and we always have done this, was especially terrible. So really the fault is strongly at the Speaker's feet. That's where the problem is. But the Prime Minister should have known better. He did this for pure campaign purposes. So I and about 29 people signed a letter early on and said, look, this is a bad idea. We should retime this and have him come another time. And that was our suggestion. And then from there, they clearly weren't going to do that. A number of us, I don't like the word boycott. Maybe I'm Wisconsin nice a little bit, we don't do it. But a lot of us didn't go to the speech. Some people called it a boycott. I watched it from my office. But a lot of us were on the floor. Some of my colleagues, who I have a lot of respect for, who did go, said, well, I'm going to go and I'm not going to applaud and I'm not going to stand up. But when you get in that group dynamic, it's awful hard. And you didn't see a lot of people sitting down and not applauding. So I'm glad I did what I did. But I didn't go to the speech. And some people may not like that, but I thought that to condone that after, and sure enough, today, I don't know if you saw, but the Prime Minister used footage from that speech in a commercial right now with all of the members of Congress applauding him. So it was exactly what we knew. It was 25 minutes just of attacking Iran with a lot of facts that, quite honestly, I'm going to trust U.S. intelligence because I represent the U.S. government before I trust Israeli intelligence or what they're trying to say on this issue. And let's face it, no one wants a nuke in Iran, but we want peace in the region, and the President's trying to work towards that. And we don't have the best long-term effect in that region, period, right? Whether it be Iraq or Afghanistan or other places. we need to have players in that region leading, and we can talk about that more with ISIS. But so what happened out of that was the senators must have decided that we needed to double down on the rhetoric that was kind of put out there. And what they did was they put out this letter, 47 of them signed, saying to the Prime Minister, or to the Ayatollah, one, you may not understand our form of government. He's condescending tone and everything. And basically saying, but we can overturn this, don't expect this to last past the president. Factually incorrect. And some people are calling it treasonous. Again, I hold back my language somewhat. But clearly, it was a blunder. In fact, what the analysis I read is this will make the more hardcore Ayatollahs and that faction within the Iranian government even stronger, because now they can say, see, we can't trust the U.S., look what they're saying, and then you go back to not having anything maybe towards a path to peace. So I think, personally, this has a lot more to do with people trying to appease to the U.S. presence that helps fund its campaigns that care about this issue. And this was really more about an overture to them, trying to show how tough they were. And I think ultimately, again, I don't think it's a good sign for peace. I'll try not to answer every question that long, but I think that question required the first part of it related to the speech from the Prime Minister. Why isn't anyone bringing up Scott Walker's devastating effect on Wisconsin and his plan to run for president? First of all, I think a lot of people are bringing up what Scott Walker's doing, at least we're trying to. It's up to the press whether or not they report it. And that's what I've noticed more than anything. A lot of things that we may say in Washington or in Madison, unless reporters pick it up, it didn't happen, right? That's kind of the reality of how it gets covered. So let's look at just the most recent thing he did on right to work. I just got done explaining that the economy, everything is going up except for wages are flat. So the thing he does is the one thing that's going to bring wages down even further. It was the complete wrong thing to do for the state. Was it for the state? No. It's for his run for president, because let's face it, his foreign policy experience previous to this is probably a family trip to the Epcot Center, right? So he's trying to beef up his credentials, and his beefing up of credentials are taking on 100,000 ISIS, or 100,000 union protesters. He can take on ISIS. It's a ridiculous statement. But he had to double down on it. So then he said, I think the single greatest foreign policy thing that President Reagan ever did, because they all get excited when we talk about Reagan on that side, is to fire the air traffic controllers. So they keep on trying to double down. This is his appeal. I heard Charlie Cook, who does the Cook Report, it's a political report out of Washington. It's a really great analysis to see what's going on around the country in elections. He was on Bill Press 2 days ago in the morning on the mic. And Charlie Cook's analysis was that in the Republican Party, among conservatives, 95% don't like unions. Among Republicans in general, it's like 75%. This is perfect for him for red meat for a primary for president. So it had nothing to do about Wisconsin, nothing to do about our economy. This is all about Scott Walker desperately wanting to be president. So everything we see, flip-flops on issues now if it's convenient, he'll do whatever it takes to get elected, and that's what we're seeing. So I can assure you, I happen to be spending some time this summer in Iowa and New Hampshire. I don't know why, they're nice states to go visit, but I think I may have some things to talk about with reporters. We're going to do everything we can to get that message out so more people know about it. But we are working with the National Democratic Party. We're working with a lot of people to make sure they know about the real Scott Walker. Don't forget, I served in the legislature with Scott Walker. He was the chair of the Corrections Committee when I was the ranking Democrat on the committee. Sonia and I visited many prisons during the day. And we're going to talk about Scott Walker. And people are doing it. And I want to give a lot of credit to a local group, the Center for Media Democracy. Lisa Graves and Mary Batari and others are doing a fantastic job in getting the word out. You know, they were the ones who caught the changes in the wording to the Wisconsin idea that he was going to do in the budget. And Mary said, I think she told me there was 5,500 different clips on that, based on that article alone. And they put that out there. So we've got groups doing it. It's just you got to get the reporters to pick it up and talk about it. But I think it's happening, and I think his missteps from when he was in London and asked about evolution, and he said, I'm going to punt on this. That's an inside voice, not your outside voice, Scott. You might say, I'm going to punt on this, but you don't actually say it. And then when they asked him if the president loves his country, and he said, I don't know. Is the president, a Christian? I don't know. You can't keep getting away with that. It's going to eventually catch up with them. So we're going to talk about it. People aren't talking about it. Trust me, it's just a matter of getting the press to pick it up. Do Democrats understand that their failure to counter the right-wing attacks leaves the impression that the right-wingers are correct in the course they're setting for America? I'm going to relate it a little bit back to that last one. I mean, it is frustrating for those of us. I'm very active in the Progressive Caucus. We do a lot of work. We're doing rallies. We have an hour on the floor every week. I used to run that for us on the floor of Congress. We talk about these things, but if they don't, again, get picked up by the media, it's a little more difficult. I will say in the last election cycle, I think we failed on our messaging. I think we had people who were afraid and wanted to run to the middle. And I'll tell you, in my opinion, when you run to the middle, you don't stand for anything. People know what the other side, at least they know they have the courage of their convictions. And if you're not saying it, you're not going to get elected. You're not motivating people to come out and vote. Now, California, New York, terrible turnout. New York, Governor Cuomo, he's kind of one of those guys who likes to appeal what he thinks right down the middle. We didn't give anyone a reason to come out. We nearly lost some elections we should have in Congress, and we did lose legislative races. So I think we need to have a message that really talks directly to the middle class and those aspiring to be in the middle class. I know those are overused terms, but about the economy and wages. I think that's what we need to do. We did talk about the minimum wage, but there was a great article in the New York Times 6 or 8 weeks ago, and they talked about the 30 to 55-year-old white Southern male who used to make $25 or $30 an hour before their job got outsourced, and now they can make $10 an hour. Now, to them, minimum wage is $10. They already make $10 an hour. He wasn't talking to them, but you can't make your mortgage payments on $10 an hour. You can't send your kids to college at $10 an hour. We need to have a much better message that focuses on how we're going to increase those wages, why a woman's making 78 cents on a dollar. Real hardcore, I think, economic message that's stronger. I can tell you that of my friends in Congress who came in my class, the ones who came back in tough districts ran with President Obama in their commercials and didn't run away from the Affordable Care Act and all those issues. And the ones who did and didn't stand for much didn't come back. And there were some really good people who ran some bad campaigns. So I think we just have to be more core to our message. The people agree with us on the issues, and if we're not talking about that, then that's our own demise. What do you think of legalizing marijuana in Wisconsin? I'm glad you give me all the easy questions. Honestly, I think, this is where the country is probably moving. You look at Colorado and Washington, then they had ballot measures in Oregon and Alaska where it was approved by voters. At minimum, we should have medical marijuana. I used to be the author of the medical marijuana bill. I think it's a no-brainer for many reasons. I've had plenty of evidence. I'll never forget doing public radio one time on it, and a gentleman called up from the La Crosse area. And he said, my wife is going through chemo and other cancer treatments right now. She doesn't have an appetite. We're trying to get her healthy and trying to get marijuana. I'm sending my high school kid out on the street to get medicine so that she can feel better, so that she can eat. And just listening to that is far more persuasive than anything a politician tells you about it. It is real people. So at minimum that, but I think we should really look at what Colorado and Washington are doing. I'm guessing it is the direction where things are going. In Wisconsin right now, Sandy, do you see any movement in the state? I'm not seeing this legislature, unless you throw in the name Ronald Reagan bill to legalize marijuana. You're probably not going to get their attention. So it's probably not going to happen here very soon, or medical marijuana, unfortunately.
Mark, we do have the bill out on the co-author.
For the medical marijuana.
Yeah, it's not going anywhere, but it's out there.
Yeah. But more and more states are doing it, and everyone understands it. I think at the federal level, I'm on almost every bill to legalize or decriminalize marijuana because right now, even the states that have legally voted to have legalized marijuana, they still can't put their money in a bank because of federal law. There's all these other federal provisions. We still classify marijuana the same as we classify heroin under federal law. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can try to clean up. So, and I also have a bill to allow our tribal nations to be able to grow it. We're trying to work with the tribes on that. So I think it's definitely worth looking at. I got a blank one here, so I'll let that go. Bipartisanship in the House. Are there any signs from your Republican friends that there's a willingness to moderate the ultra-conservative rhetoric in the House? What progressive legislation have you supported that you consider maybe a chance of passage in the season of Congress? Okay, let me take the first one. There there are some people, on my floor, okay, I have a Republican friend, Richard Hanna from New York State. He's a moderate Republican. I think he gets more upset than I do when all this stuff happens, because he's in the majority. He could actually pass legislation, and they want to focus on all this right-wing stuff that he knows is crazy. He is for marriage equality. The day the Supreme Court decision was announced on marriage a year and a half ago, he came to my office and said, "Why don't you and Phil fly out to New York and I'll officiate your wedding?" To quote the Vice President, that's a pretty big effing deal, right? You know, a Republican member does that. There are people like that. Reed Ribble from Wisconsin, quite honestly, is very conservative. I don't agree with him on a lot of the issues, but is very pragmatic and someone who I think you can work with. There are people like that. The problem is it's not in the leadership. And the leadership is letting that tail wag the dog of those hardcore Tea Party people that I can work with them on a few issues. You know, on NSA stuff, I work with some of the Tea Party folks. I'm trying to work with them on the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal because there's some constitutional authority stuff we can work with them on. But we only meet in a few places, and all this stuff on just tearing down, really attack on the poor. You know, I don't think enough of us talk about poverty, and I know it doesn't get you votes, but you need to talk about it because it's the important thing to do. They're going to try to attack food stamps again. Last session, originally they were going to do a $20 billion cut to food stamps. I was told by the Second Harvest Food Bank they would have to double output just to make up for what that would do in the community. But that wasn't enough for the far right wing, so they wanted to do it, separate it out into a $39 billion cut, twice as much cut to food stamps. So a few of us for a week lived on food stamps to show what it was like. So I had my $31.50, that's what you get. 2/3 of the people who get the stamp program are women and children. Not exactly your, welfare, lazy welfare people, I mean, people who need it for hunger. 90% of the people, I think, well, I'm not going to say stats, I don't have it in front of me. But, so I had $31.50. I bought a bag of oranges, that was like $6. That was my biggest expense. Got my peanut butter, my ramen noodle soup, and all the stuff you got. By the end of the week, I went through everything, and I was pretty hungry all week. And to say that's the single best program we have to keep kids out of starvation. And they want to cut it down. With what they did, the new rate right now people get is 29 something. They already lost a couple dollars in buying power just off of that. And they're going to come back and do it again. So, any signs that good things are going to pass? No, unless they decide to try to negotiate with the president because they actually want to get something done and we can have some influence. I'm guessing it's going to be probably more unproductivity, which is better than bad things passing. That's not a silver lining, that's like an old pewter lining, but that's the best I can say on that. Progressive legislation that we'd like to see passed. I don't know if this Congress will pass very much that's progressive. However, that doesn't mean you don't introduce things and talk about things. And I'm going to use this as a quick opportunity to talk about my constitutional amendment to guarantee a right to vote in the Constitution, the one that Keith Ellison and I are doing. And let me give this as an example. So we saw what the Supreme Court did a year and a half ago on the Voting Rights Act, and for the southern states that have had traditionally bad reputation on voting, well, not southern states anymore, right? Wisconsin, we have the photo ID, we have shorter early voting, we have the same attacks on what they're trying to do. The problem is, when the Constitution was written, about 20-25% of the people can vote, white, male, property owners over 21. That's clearly not where we are as a country, but there is no explicit right to vote in the Constitution. It's implied. They talk about discrimination in voting in the Constitution, but there's not an explicit right, and because there's not an explicit right, you have to prove you've been harmed by the state making a change, rather than the state having to prove they won't harm anyone because they have a constitutional right to vote. It completely changes the burden. So rather than attacking this state by state as they try to do these measures, we're trying to have that 30,000 foot, the bigger look at it and say, look, this is what we really should, because everyone assumes it. In fact, when you become a citizen, you take the citizenship test, one of the questions is, what's your most important right as an American? And the answer is the right to vote. And yet it's not an explicit right in the Constitution. So I can talk about that around the country. We have more sponsors in the first 2 months of this session than I had the entire last session. NAACP is on support with us now, Fair Vote, other groups. I'm reaching out to groups on a regular basis where Reverend Jackson is going around having city councils vote on this. And so we're moving forward. So that's what I'm more in the advocacy role of putting ideas out there and trying to see what kind of support we can build. Because let's face it, you don't ever really think we're the leaders. Like, the elected officials, it's the people lead, and eventually the leaders follow. I know that's a bumper sticker, but it's a really also valid statement that generally, when you can show their support in the grassroots, eventually those kind of ideas happen. And let me give you one other example, because I'm really proud of my work with the Progressive Caucus. I mean, that's where my values are. Those are my friends, and we're fighting, I think, the hardest within Congress for things. We have had what we call the financial transaction fee, but really it's a Wall Street speculation fees for high-end trading, not for everything you do at a bank. And there's not one in place, and yet a lot of money is made there that's not at the same taxation rates that we pay for everything that we do to earn incomes. So we've had it in the Progressive Caucus version of a budget that we're going to release again next week, and we always call it a people's budget, we have a different name every year. But that idea has now gone mainstream. So Chris Van Hollen, the ranking Dem on the Budget Committee, has proposed, because the European Union is doing this, a small fee on those transactions. That raises a lot of revenue. Now, the only difference I might have with Chris Van Hollen is he wants it automatically to go to a middle-class tax cut. I would like to make sure we have funding for all the programs that the Republicans keep cutting first. But the fact that that idea now has moved, and now we're talking about it in a more mainstream way, and the European Union is doing it, I predict in the near future, even Republicans will be looking at this as a reasonable revenue source and something we can do. So that's the kind of work that can happen, but don't look for anything reasonable to actually pass. I think that's probably hard to have happen. 47 senators, again, I think I addressed that. Anything additional people wanted to hear on that, in your opinion, to violate the law, and if so, what type of needs to be done? I can't tell you if I think for sure it violated the law, but it violated common sense and logic and decency. What can be done to restore postal delivery standards? I know that's you, Keith. Keith is always obvious. So, a couple of things. I think we need to allow the post office to find some additional ways to raise revenue. There's a lot of ideas out there from, if you think about it, if you go to a UPS store now, like they do like other little things, like copies and some other things. If we did some of the basic stuff, like you do licensing for fishing licenses and things like that, where they all get to keep a little bit amount of the money, you can raise some additional revenue. And that's where people come into the community, is to that post office. We can offer some additional services that don't compete with local businesses directly, but that would make some sense. I think that's one way we could provide some new revenue.
Is the legislation that's in Congress to restore it, is that going to go anywhere?
It depends. So there's been legislation. I used to be on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee before I went to Education and Workforce. When I got elected, no Democratic freshman could get on the Education Committee because we do everything by seniority. And then it was opening during the year, and I did leave the committee to go to that committee because I really wanted to get on there, and I was very fortunate to have that happen. But on Oversight and Government Reform, we kind of have the overview for the Postal Service. And on the Postal Service, Darrell Lyson, who was the chair of the committee, who is a very interesting member of Congress, was strongly behind this bill and wanted it, but he really wanted to privatize it, right? Everything from cluster boxes to getting rid of Saturday delivery, closing down these processing centers. But the real goal was to privatize Postal Service. We were fortunate because I think a lot of people in leadership on the Republican side, Darrell Lyson was their favorite member item. And it didn't really go very far. I think the worst thing that could happen to us is if someone else takes this on who's more well-liked, then we've got to deal with some of those issues. But they've also talked about possibly allowing some basic banking services within post offices. There's other ideas out there. And we don't want to raise rates too much because there's a balance between the bulk and the first class, but still, for 49 cents, you're getting an amazing deal. The only problem is right now, everything from Southwest Wisconsin that used to come to Madison to go back to Southwest Wisconsin, now comes to Madison, goes to Milwaukee, comes back to Madison, goes back to that letter going across the street, now it takes multiple days. And there's an intention to what's all going on, and we're responding. I think the post office made a mistake by responding to Republican legislation that's not passed yet. And I think that might ultimately hurt the profitability, so we need to do some other things to address that. So we're still trying to get that through. Where this Congress goes, I don't know, but the good news is the lead advocate for all this reform hasn't been very effective, so let's hope he keeps his strong and steadfast advocacy. When the Dems were in control of both houses in Wisconsin, why did we go to an impartial redistricting in Wisconsin? That's a good, fair question. We had a lot of difficulty, as Sandy can let you know, on a variety of issues. When you have a Democratic Senate, Democratic Governor, Democratic Assembly on paper, you think, wow, you could get a lot of things done. when you have a Democratic governor and a Democratic Senate leader who definitely didn't see eye to eye and different priorities, we had a lot of difficulty in getting things done. So even though a lot of us had advocated for doing the Iowa-California model, it would have made sense. It was one cycle off from doing it, and some people on one house made an argument that that would be a bad idea to do that, and we didn't get it done, and we lost our opportunity. Honestly, the best time to do a redistricting proposal is as early as possible, because what you want to do is take it away from the current members, because then you start thinking, well, I still have a district, I live at the edge of the district, they put their self-interest in there. If you do it 10 years out, 8 years out, you make it less likely that's a problem. So I went and talked to a number of the editorial boards. Even while I was in Congress, I still dabble in some of the state issues because I'm a citizen and I want to have a say. And I talked to them, they were all very aggressive. Most editorial boards are strongly in favor of doing this redistricting thing. We're trying to continue to build that. The problem is that this Assembly and this Senate, I think it's going to be really hard to see that happen. So, but I wish a lot of things we could have gotten done at that time. We got a lot of good things done. We made sure every child in Wisconsin got health insurance. We passed a domestic partnership law for recognition in spite of having a constitutional amendment. We did a lot of tax policy that was very successful. In the budget, the thing I'm really proud of is, don't forget, in 2008 we had the economy crash. Democrats got the brunt of it. We had a $6.5 billion hole when we finally were in control of both houses in the governorship. To make up for that, we did raise about $2 billion in new revenue. We had about $2.5 billion in cuts, and we had about $2 billion coming from the Recovery Act that the President and Congress gave us that helped save a lot of states. And what's interesting is as much as the Republicans complain about every dime of revenue, when they took charge, they kept 97, 98% of what we did because they realized they really needed that revenue. So we stood up, and no one wants to ever talk about revenue. We did a lot of revenue, and I think it helped save us in a lot for years forward on schools and things like that. Civics education for our children. My awareness is that there is a severe lack of knowledge among middle and high school students of the detailed contents of the Declaration of Independence, of the Constitution, and the amendments to the Constitution. Even though education is in the province of the state, or the province of the states, should the Congress influence civics education of our children? I saw some stuff recently where I actually think we should put back in civics education. There's no question. So we want smart, intelligent people making decisions, going out and voting. I think it makes sense to do that. We have to have that involvement however we can possibly do it. So there have been proposals talking about not having that. It does have a detrimental effect. I think it would make a lot of sense. But I'll tell you, our fights in education are even bigger than that. So we just had the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Let me just talk about that for a second since we're just loosely on education. In the Republican version of the bill, there's things that haven't been changed for half a century for a reason. Things like the aid that goes to districts with higher amounts of poverty. If you reach 30% of kids with reduced free lunch, there's a kicker how much money that district gets. There's another kicker, I think, of 50 or 60%. And there's a reason, because when you have more kids who are living in poverty, there's more challenges for those kids to get education. Let me give you an example. I know Sondi is our expert in education in the Assembly, actually probably the entire legislature. So I'm going to offer you a little, but Sondi can tell you a whole lot more about this. I used to visit a lot of schools, not just around here, but in Milwaukee. I remember going to Stuyvesant Middle School in the inner city of Milwaukee. A couple kids and the principal gave us a tour through the school, heavily free and reduced neighborhood. A lot of the kids, quite honestly, come from a single parent family where often they're out the door in the morning, when it's dark at night, they come back home, and the school is pretty much there for them for everything else, from breakfast to lunch to after school programs. It's pretty much the structure to much of their life. We went to the library, and there were 30 kids meeting, and it was called a loss group. It was for kids who lost someone close to them through non-natural methods, in other words, drugs, AIDS, or violence. It was one of 4 groups that size in that middle school. That's part of the struggle you have when you have a district with a higher rate of poverty. So one of the things they did is broke the 50 years of doing that, and they wanted to give every single kid in poverty takes the money with them to whatever school. So if a wealthier district had a small number of poor kids, they would get those extra dollars, and they could take away that increased amount for kids living in the other schools. What that meant, for example, in Milwaukee schools would lose, make sure I'm saying, $160 million just through what this bill was going to do. So that's one part of it. They're going to take away the maintenance of efforts. So the fact that Scott Walker, what he's doing to the university right now, 300 million cut, that's because they haven't done a maintenance of effort. He could do that just as easily in public schools. They're going to take that away, maintenance of effort. They're going to take all the literacy programs and the after-school programs and all the things that we provide specific requirements and funding for and put it into giant block grants. So if a school wanted to use it instead for hunting education, they can use it for hunting education instead of a literacy program because the locals know best under their view. That's the kind of stuff that they were putting forward in the House version of this reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind. So we've got bigger fights in education. As much as that's very important, it should be talked about proactively because when we talk about it, eventually we'll build that support. Right now, we're really in that defensive mode of fighting some really bad things. Are our democratic institutions equal to the dynamics of the polarization effect created by modern communications technology, cable news? Okay, I'm going to guess what I think whoever wrote this is asking. Is this about the 24/7 news cycle and how that affects some things? Sorry, is that? No. Okay, I just want to make sure I understood. So it is a big influence because what winds up happening is because everything can be sent out. Right now, you could be sending something on Twitter and it can be picked up, and eventually, I mean, before I leave here, there could be an article, a post, or on a conservative blog about something I said. That's the reality of the news cycle. I'm sorry.
And it's not just that it's so fast, but you've got all these echo chambers going where people only watch their own thing.
Sure,
You know,
like
sort of
Fox News,
MSNBC.
MSNBC, sure. And that is a big part of it, right? Because I think I just saw, and I hate to admit this, but I think Fox News was just voted the most reliable news by some poll that they took of people, which, but the problem is, but when you start breaking out, you know, it's not just the three big networks like you used to have, and now you've got so many different things. It's broken up more. You don't have the same thing. Same thing in newspapers. I mean, the Capital Times is only online now. And, you know, I still love a paper newspaper as a journalism major. That's the way I enjoyed it. But it's just you've lost a lot of the people who used to do a lot of the writing. And, you know, we lose some really talented reporters. So it used to be you had someone covered the Assembly, someone covered the Senate, someone covered the governorship, someone covered the Supreme Court. Now sometimes you have a reporter covering the government, the legislature, and then they have to do all the court stuff also. I remember one of the Milwaukee Journal reporters I talked to, Journal Sentinel reporters who used to work here, said it feels like he's a court reporter now, even though he's covering the Capitol because of all the stuff he's got to do. You've lost that check and balance that we get from the third estate, and that's a problem. But also that 24/7, people want to get out there right away and say something. You know, sometimes you don't have all the facts, you don't have all the details, and Ted Cruz will still say something, right? And then that'll be what's in the news. And so you're fighting that a lot, and I don't have an answer because I think that's where we're at now. We're just going to have to learn to live with that a little more. But it does make it harder to hold the accountability in them too, and it definitely makes it harder for us sometimes to get attention. Like I said, unless they report us saying something, it didn't happen. And you know, we have great press conferences on living wage and on you know, all these different things that I'm always involved with in Washington. And you know, rarely do they make it out of the little belt place sometimes that we're there, and it's just hard to get that coverage. Now that was all the cards I had. So oh, more coming in. Okay, I'll go ahead and ask your question while I'm taking these in.
Yeah, structural issues are really important to me. The idea that a few individuals, I think I saw something like 97 people, are basically guiding through foundations and organizations like the political dialogue and eventually the proposed legislation in the United States. Is there any chance, do you see any possibility that Citizens United will be overturned in the near future?
You know, I'll tell you, anything is hard with this Congress. However, there's a lot of groups pushing for it. I think the group that, in my opinion, is doing the most effective job is the Move to Amend group, because they're going community to community and getting votes lined up and really building up from the grassroots, because that's what's got to happen. So I think those efforts are probably the best right now. Bottom line is this money in politics pollutes everything. You know, it used to be 2 cycles ago that the #1 way to get elected to Congress was to get reelected, right? That's the highest percent. If you're incumbent, the single best thing was like 94 or 96% chance you're going to get reelected. That changed about 2 cycles ago to whoever raised the most money was like 95 or 96% more likely to get elected. And anything else in life, that's called an auction, right? If you bid more, you buy it. And now that's what's happened in politics. And now just in the last omnibus, the budget bill we had in December, when there was a provision that allowed the biggest donors to get rid of the caps on how much they can give, so the Koch brothers can even have more free speech somehow, that even influenced the process more. So I'm excited that Russ Feingold is being considered as a candidate for the U.S. Senate right now, because I'd love to have his voice back in the U.S. Senate, because he's been so strong on this issue. And when I saw the poll yesterday showing that if he was running right now, he'd beat Ron Johnson, that was at 9 points. Is there any movement for a revenue-neutral carbon tax? Sure need one. So what this issue is with all the companies and utilities and others that put out output, could we find a way to tax that? So you're actually capturing something and go back. And there's different ways to do it that people have proposed, but to me, the fundamentals go back to either investing in clean alternatives or a kickback to folks so they can see a benefit out of capturing this to try to put a cost down so you can reduce carbon in that way. I think there's a promising idea. There are some conservative think tanks who think it's fair because it's charging people for what they're doing, right? So there is some actual left-right connections on it, but it's difficult because I'm in a Congress where people don't believe in climate change. In fact, you see Florida now, the governor said they can't use the words climate change or global warming in any communications. I mean, the science committee is full of people who don't believe in science. So it's difficult. I remember a year ago this winter, I think it was, Damon probably know, I was on the floor, because I belong to the State Climate Caucus where we try to talk about this. We either write articles or go on the floor and talk about this on a regular basis. And I was talking about, in Wisconsin, the fact that we've got, I think it's 15 fewer days of ice fishing in the last 150 years because of global warming. And Charlie Sykes and all the Milwaukee Talk Radio and all the conservative blogs attacked me. Yeah, it was during the polar vortex. I timed it really well. And they're like, oh, he has to get back home. What's he talking about? It's so cold. Well, luckily, PolitiFact picked it up. And they went to the same place we did, the UW Limnology Department, and they've been tracking this for 150 years, and sure enough, in 150 years, we have lost about 15 days of ice fishing. So there is clearly change that's going on, and by every scientist who studies science, it's just these other folks who necessarily don't, that's the problem. So it's difficult to get something through with this Congress, but we're all continuing to talk about it. And again, I think we're going to win on these issues. We just have to have enormous patience. I used to say when I was in the state capitol, sometimes things move like a tortoise. In Washington, they move like an upside-down tortoise. Right? You see those little turtle just slowly flailing, right? But if you have the patience and you continue the fight every day, we're going to win on these. People ultimately agree with us, but it is, if I didn't already have no hair, I would have none. One problem contributing to urban poverty is the fact that federal eligibility scales for Medicaid of child care, TANF, etc., are not tied to actual local cost of living, which is the charts show 233% in the state. I'm sorry, I'm going to skip a chart one just because I'm going to go all day. That's all right. Can we paraphrase it maybe a little smaller than...
Yeah, basically, a lot of people look at poverty issues in cultural senses. That's how a lot of times it's explained. But when I really started digging into it, the federal eligibility scales vary so much in the state that you can basically get various forms of welfare subsidies in about 50 or 60 counties. And if you can get a job, which is a big issue, you can transition from poverty to self-sufficiency. But you get into Dane County, especially Madison, you get into Milwaukee County, you get into Waukesha County, you basically reach this point where things are going well. So if you had a minimum wage increase, these people would actually be pushed against a wall, ultimately, where they lose their benefits, then they crash and they go back, and that contributes to a cycle of poverty. And I don't know if we can deal, and some of that has to do with how it plays out on each state basis, but if you have federal eligibility scales that aren't tiered, where you don't have an urban, like in a place like this, where you literally have 233% difference in cost of living.
Well, let me just say this. I think if we actually raise minimum wage, we would adjust the other scales. Clearly, we would have to do some of that. And the problem is, I don't think this Congress is going to be talking about raising the minimum wage. Actually, if we got it to the floor, I think there's enough votes for it. If we had immigration reform to the floor, there'd be enough votes for it from the comments people have made back home and what we have. If we had employment non-discrimination on the floor, there's enough votes for it. we go down the list of things that if we are able to put on the floor, the problem is, Speaker Boehner, because of the Hastert rule, or former Speaker Denny Hastert, the rule is unless you have a majority of the majority supporting something, they can't put it on the floor, and that's why he's now allowed to come and get Democratic votes. He broke the rule on the Homeland Security thing, but even that was kind of a bait and switch, right? That night, that Friday night, minutes before it was going to close down, he did the 1-week extension. But I think we all know that he later said, oh, there was a Florida rule that allowed this to be objected by any Senate Democrat, any single Democrat. And so they knew what was happening. He did happen to do the right thing there. But then he let us home a day early because of a snowstorm. I just think he didn't want a storm from his members, and he wanted to get them out of town before they reacted. So I got a benefit day home. I was happy about that. But, that's our problem, replacing these things. Any other questions I could try to answer from the floor?
Mark, we got a couple minutes here.
Yeah.
Just a couple left.
Okay. Do you think more Democrats and independents would get out and vote in 2016 if Scott Walker were to get the nomination than if a more moderate Republican was the candidate? I look at it as 2016 should be a good year because when more people vote, they do in presidential years, Democrats do better, progressives do better, right? We have more people agree with us on the issues. The problem is getting people out to vote. And like I said last time, we didn't talk to voters. Sometimes we were too afraid to talk to voters. Let me give you a little example of, in California, the turnout was so low. One of my friends and my colleagues, Mark Pocan, on election night, he had 45,000 votes, and his Republican opponent had 36,000 votes. My Republican opponent, they got 31.5% of the vote, got 20,000 more votes than they did combined. I got 225,000 more votes than any Democrat in the entire country. We had the turnout, we had the intensity. Folks came out and did that, and it was really important. But when turnout's that low, we don't do well. We lost a lot of seats that we never should have lost. And 2016 will be a good turnout. So we can get, whoever's on the ticket will be a strong turnout. Now, I think there's interesting variables. If Hillary or Elizabeth Warren's on the ticket, I think that's really strong in getting more people to see the first chance to get the first woman elected. I think that's great for turnout. I think that's really positive. I don't think Elizabeth Warren, unfortunately, is going to run, although she really is as great as many of you may think. I've really enjoyed working with her. I've had a chance to read her biography. You read that biography, what an amazing background. I mean, she's really amazing to work with. And I love how she and Robert Reich do. I'm sorry, I'm taking this side, but this is my Elizabeth Warren moment. But she and Robert Reich, because I think it's because they're professors, they can bring things down to a very common way to explain really complex stuff like derivative, funding by the big banks and stuff like that. And they just do it really well. But depending who's on the ticket, no matter who's on the ticket, we do better. It's presidential year because the amount of attention that goes to it. Depending who's on, that can even be better in other ways. Scott Walker, if he's on, he's got to make it through the primaries first. It's not good to be leading. Right now, at this point, he's kind of the Michelle Bachmann right now of the last cycle, where he's at. And it may not be the best spot to be. I still think that Jeb Bush, the fact that he's doing the more traditional route, right now doing a lot of fundraising, he's your more traditional Republican candidate, and they have a tendency to go with the more traditional candidate. I was told by someone today, I gotta be careful so I don't want to disclose information I shouldn't say, but it was an organization that was meeting with him in Washington, and it's a major piece of legislation that he was talking to them about, and he clearly didn't know what he was talking about. And finally someone said to him, do you even know what the law does? So he is the Scott Walker we all know, right? That's him. So I think that's going to come up more. I would be surprised if he would be the nominee in the end. I think it's more likely Jeb Bush, but who knows? That's their party and what's going to happen. But it's a good year for us. As more people come out, we really need to have a good turnout, not just in 16, but think about 18. And we can't just think about the next one. We also got to think Tammy's up for re-election in 2018, in an off year, and the governorship is up. And this governorship will be for when redistricting is going to happen. So I think, personally, my views alone, that Scott Walker is helping us right now because he's doing so many extreme things. When former Speaker John Gard is criticizing them for making their base too narrow, wow, that's narrow. So It should be a good year for us. We just have to make sure that we're talking about issues that people really want to hear, talk about what people talk about at their kitchen tables, and then we'll do a lot better. I can take a couple more questions. Yeah.
Okay, this is envy, but I think Republicans are so good at spin. And everything they introduce, every headline they grab has the perfect spin. And I wish the Democrats would do more of that.
Hallelujah. I'm with you. I think in the last election cycle, one of the local newscasters, because I don't want to get that person in trouble, I saw the day after the election. And this person said to me, can you tell me one thing that was in Mary Burke's jobs plan? I couldn't tell you one thing that was in the plan. I really couldn't. That person said Republicans are for lower taxes, less bureaucracy, freezing tuition. That was what they said all the time. They just said those things with 3 fingers in a few seconds. And Democrats had this big plan. In the House, a couple months out, we were given the things to talk about for the election, and it was a 16-point plan. So don't forget point 8B, all right? It's like we're not doing it as good. They have like Frank Luntz and people like that who on Fox you watch, they do the little dial controls. They're very specific on their wording, what they do. They are far more disciplined, and we need to be better at that. And I think that's hopefully one of the lessons we learned from the last cycle. The Senate, I know right away did an analysis of what they did wrong, and they're trying to learn from that. House is doing the same thing. We know that we should have talked about wages instead of some of the things we did, which was all over the place. And hopefully we'll learn from that lesson. If we don't, it won't be what we need to have. We'll shoot ourselves in the foot. We have to pick up 30 seats in the House to get the majority. The Senate's much tighter. And Wisconsin, right now on the list, is number 2 most likely to flip. It's Illinois and then Wisconsin. Yes.
I think we also need to, going back to the governorship in 2018, get somebody with real fighting spirit. I call him Fighting Scott Walker, because he really goes to the gut and gets people motivated on motion. And Mary Burke was far more qualified, but she didn't get to the gut. And we need somebody who doesn't direct it.
I hear you. And presidential race too. I mean, personally, I'm one of the people in the camp of I think a primary is good. I don't want a coronation. I want a primary because I want to make sure that we're hearing issues talked about the way they need to be talked about in that primary schedule. It helps make someone more ready for the rest of the election cycle. And hopefully we'll see that, because I do think it makes you a better candidate. Yes?
I want to hear one Democrat get up and say, this is what the Republican Party is doing. This is what they are trying to do to you in this country. And we need to disagree with that. Somebody needs to get up there and make it known. People don't realize they just are so organized. It's frightening.
Well, Linda, one of the things we're going to try to do next week, we go back, unless they change the date, which they might, because they're having a struggle not even putting their budget together right now. Because don't forget, they have the defense hawks, and then they have the Tea Party who really don't believe in anything, even including defense spending. They want to reduce it, which, again, we may have some overlap in that. So if we get together, we're going to be talking about the budget. That's one of those areas where we kind of do. We show, because the budget to me is a statement, the statement of your values as a party, and they're going to lay that out. And we will talk about what they're going to have to do to Social Security, what they're going to do to you with Medicare, what they'll be doing to education funding. My problem is we'll do that from 10 in the morning until probably 10 at night, sometimes midnight, depends on how long it takes that day. And you'll probably see, maybe MSNBC will do a story on it. We get very little coverage on it again. So that's our difficulty, because I think we do, and there's so many things to point out in a budget. That's why I love being on the budget committee, because that really is where everything is shown. I mean, Paul Ryan, in the last budget, we love to point out, he said, we'll balance everything in 10 years. There was a $2 trillion hole in his budget. He repealed the Affordable Care Act, but he kept the revenue and savings from it. And you can't do it, it's illogical. And that was a $2 trillion hole. So fuzzy math, I mean, that's math you can't even eat, right? If that was like a fruit, you have to throw it out. And so we try to talk about those things. It's just how we get it picked up. And the problem is we have MSNBC covers things well, but it's harder to get things. And on Sunday morning programs, I'm sorry, but man, they are dull and boring, and they don't take up anything. They don't challenge people. So we need to have that. But, we can do this. This is actually a really great talk tonight. And by the way, thank you. I mean, it's great to see this many people come out tonight and want to have this conversation. But we need to do much, much, much more. Thank you. Yes?
In the Supreme Court, there's a going to be a decision on the Affordable Care Act. And if it goes wrong, it's devastating. Do we have anything that we can, if it goes wrong, that can be done to save folks from the...
I think right now, from discussions we're having with the White House and folks who are heavily involved in this, they feel we're in very strong footing right now for the Supreme Court decisions. I think that's the public face of where we're at on this. If you want to talk about Affordable Care Act, a few of the things I like to mention is it's 11.8 million, I think they said today, people now signed up through a federal or state exchange. Millions more have stayed on their parents' policies until they're 26. I mean, it's accomplished what we said. Healthcare costs, Frank Byrne, former CEO of Meritor, was at a luncheon I was at a few weeks ago, and he said, if you look at where healthcare costs were going and where they leveled out since this law was passed and what it's doing to hold down costs, it's accomplishing everything we wanted to. Now, the one caveat I would have that Nancy Pelosi right now would be mad at me for saying is I do think, though, we also have to say if there are tweaks to the law that have to happen, we have to be willing to tweak it. And there likely are going to be some. And to say it is the perfect law, no, it's not. Perfect law would have been Medicare for all, right? But we have what we have, the best we have. It's bringing lots of affordability and access. Think of it, pre-existing conditions no longer an issue for anyone. Women pay the same for men. There's not a difference in pay. So many good things have happened out of that. So they feel they're in good legal footing. I'm sure they have some plan Bs that they're looking at, but I don't think right now we feel we're in a pretty strong position. I think the question is, if there is a failure on it, then can we maybe reopen the conversation on how to really broaden it, just do it right? Because there is complexity to anything in healthcare right now, and but we have to be honest about if there are things that, as we implement it, aren't working, like the website, right? I mean, that was a terrible failure. We know that. So if you want a good website, you vote for Republicans. If you want healthcare, you vote for Democrats, right? That's easy enough. But we gotta, be honest when something's not working well. And I do think there are some things we need to fix. Yes.
Remember Pogo? Anybody remember Pogo? He had a famous quote. He said, I have met the enemy, and it is us. And we should not complain about water. We should complain about the people who voted for him.
And who didn't vote.
And who didn't vote. So it's our responsibility. It's difficult to do that. It's difficult to talk to people about politics. We can lose friends doing that, but we have to.
I mean, the single best thing, in the recall, looking back at the recall, it's so easy to do armchair quarterback, but we mobilized people that we've never mobilized before. And we have to get people mobilized in every single election cycle like that to talk to voters. And we're going to have some people that are going to get mad, but most part, to talk to people, they are with us on the issues. We can get them to come and vote. So we have to continue to mobilize. I think the biggest flaw of the recall is we are from Wisconsin. We are fundamentally nice people. We occasionally are passive aggressive, but we are fundamentally nice people, and the recall was not a nice way to handle getting rid of him. 70% of the people on election day didn't want to have the recall. They messaged on it, we didn't. And because of it, Scott Walker got a national fundraising base and became a national figure. So in many ways, again, I'm not saying we shouldn't have done it or anything else. I'm just saying, looking back, I think we learned some lessons out of that. But I think we should all be more than strong in what Scott Walker's doing and what those issues are and what that means. Because I think we're on the right side of those issues. So, Susan.
Well, we're going to have to still learn some more lessons about the recall because I've been talking to people about why we haven't had a publication about what the results of the recall recount were, and I was a part of that team. And let me tell you, there are two problems that have to get fixed. We got to make sure we have absolutely no touchscreen voting machines in Wisconsin, including in all of these wards in central Wisconsin and central western Wisconsin, almost 30 counties. There was no audit trail. We have to make sure that we have ballot chain of custody on the ballots from now on. And we need to have very strict fines and enforcement if there are violations, and if people make mistakes, too bad. They have to be enforced, because we've got problems in Western Racine, we've got problems in Outagamie County, and we have problems in Brown County based on the walk.
Gotcha, Susan, let me take it to here, kind of related is, one of the attacks you're gonna see coming out of the legislature is to change the Government Accountability Board. And, I think you remember the scandals we had in Wisconsin and why the former ethics board we had was a toothless body by having partisan people from Democratic and Republican Party making decisions about it, and they had to come and ask the legislature for funding to investigate ourselves. Not exactly the strongest structure. And out of it, we created the Government Accountability Board. And I went around the state with Mike Hitch, who was the Secretary of Administration under Scott Walker, and with Mark Gundrum, who's now an appeals judge in suburban Milwaukee. After we did this, to talk about it, we created it to have it tough and strong and independent for a reason. And they don't like it that it's independent because they want to control everything. They don't want their rules, they want their rules, right? So they're going to try to attack the Government Accountability Board. So we have to watch that because they're in charge of all the voting machines, the voting processes, etc. And through this budget, I'll tell you, the university cuts, I just heard today, Rob Boss said the cuts are too large, they're going to see what they can do. We still have to watch it. That's devastating cuts for the university. Right now we have a world-class university. Eventually we're going to be one of the best in the Midwest. And then eventually we've got a heck of a football team, right? That's the path you're on when you don't put the resources we need. It's an amazing economic engine for the state. Senior care, even though they're talking about fixing it, I want to fix, which means leave the law alone, not some other fix on it. We have to really watch that. My mom is 86. We're moving her into senior housing for the first time after leaving her house since 1959, 3 weeks. It's been really hard, and just watching, she gets $1,140 a month in Social Security. That's her sole income. We need to protect everyone who's on senior care and what they get from that. So that's another issue. I mean, there's so many fights we have to have, but we have to just, again, continue to talk, neighbor to neighbor about this stuff because we're on the right side of these issues, and we can win on this. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. We'll keep the dialogue going.
Mark, will you be back?
Yeah. No, anytime. I'm just down the road, right? I can go with here and Linda. We're fine. So.
Thank you so much.
Great.